Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. You have heard me talk about something called historical critical biblical criticism on this podcast many, many times. Usually right before I tell you I don't really care about it. That is partly due to my own scholarly interests. I'm more in the theology and history worlds than the Bible worlds, but I have greatly benefited from having other people who can care about it for me so that I don't have to as much. We're very lucky to have one of those people on the podcast today, Dr. Jonathan Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez has quite the academic journey. He received his Bachelor of Music from St. Olaf College in 2015, but his journey into biblical studies and his intellectual formation began at Yale Divinity School, where he met his most important intellectual influence of all, me. Jonathan and I have been friends since our seminary days, but when we weren't busy joking with each other, groaning at each other's bad puns, and watching the new Star Wars sequel trilogy together, Jonathan was learning from world-class biblical scholars like Harry Attridge, Michael Beth Dinkler, and others. He then went and pursued a Master of Sacred Theology at Lenoir-Rhyne University in Columbia, South Carolina, with a concentration in the New Testament. And last year, he graduated with his PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame, where he defended his dissertation titled The Disciplined and the Damned, Problematic Insiders and Countermeasures to Them in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of Matthew. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Ben, or should I say Father Wyatt. I hope that I can care about historical criticism so much that I can draw you over to my side. And just a quick note, I wish I had studied with Harry Attridge at Yale, but unfortunately, when I was taking courses, didn't align with when he was teaching courses. But loved my experience there at Yale.
Oh, I had forgotten that. But you're
Yeah,
right.
I studied with Hugo Mendez because he was teaching some while Professor Attridge was kind of on the fade out with retirement.
Yes. And for those of you who aren't familiar with how academia works around these things, sometimes professors will have a research leave that lasts for a semester or a year, which is really, really fun when you're a master's student and you've only got 2 years to study with folks and get letters of reference. So.
But on the other hand, I got frequent flyer miles by taking courses with Professor Michael Beth Dinkler. I took one every semester she taught, so I got 4 of those by the time I graduated.
Did you get like little punch cards, like, good for a
No,
free ice cream?
I should have.
Well, when I get rich and found my own seminary, then, we'll have a punch card system for that.
Perfect.
So, Jonathan, could you tell the listening public, when we talk about the historical critical method, there are a lot of things that we can mean by that. Can you just sort of give us an overview of what that is and, how it got started and, how it compares to other means of interpreting the Bible?
Great. Yeah, so at its core, the historical critical method is going to privilege the initial ancient context for thinking about biblical text or the events described in the Bible, thinking about their background, their composition, or their meaning. And this is necessarily going to scrutinize other ways of viewing the Bible. Sometimes it will come into direct conflict with them, and maybe a doctrinal reading, for instance, might be jettisoned. So one way of thinking about the historical critical method, we can think about it in terms of the meaning of the text. So we take the text and where do we locate the meaning? Historical criticism will often use the author to do this, and we might take the idea of law or the Torah in the New Testament. A lot of scholars today, for the vast majority of the biblical books, will contrast, for instance, Reformation understandings of the law, right? So God's demands, they'll say that's too vague and really distorts the image of what's going on with the Torah, right? So Matthew, for instance, thinks all followers of Jesus need to keep the Torah. The Torah is there so it can be kept, and it's not there just to point to Christ who fulfills it for us, right? So the historical critical method will scrutinize these understandings and sometimes directly challenge them as not the best reading of the text, right? So we can think about it in terms of meaning. We can also think of it in terms of the process in which a text was created. So I know we're going to talk about this in a second, but the synoptic problem is something historical critical scholars love to think about. It's essentially trying to explain why we have so many verbatim similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are typically called the synoptic problems. There are going to be other facets of it as well. So we'll think about pseudepigraphy, right? The act of writing in someone else's name. This was common in antiquity, which is not to say it was always approved of in antiquity, but historical critical scholars will examine the letters in the New Testament and think about, are any of these pseudepigraphal? And by far, the vast majority of historical critical scholars say yes, at least some of them, right? So thinking about process and meaning, we can also apply this to constructions of figures, Jesus being a big one. So thinking about what did the Jesus of history do in his life? That's going to be another sort of facet of historical criticism. And it started, right, so the common, if we had to associate one figure with the rise of the historical critical method, most scholars are going to locate F.C. Bauer from the Tübingen School. He taught in Tübingen in the 19th century, and he pioneered a lot of the methods that are used today. I was just talking about pseudepigraphy. He's known for thinking only 4 letters that are attributed upon the New Testament were actually written by the historical figure. So he challenged a lot of assumptions about both authorship and the meaning of these letters. He wasn't the first to do so, but he did so in a way that most resembles what we do today. So really started in Germany. If we had to locate a figure, most scholars would say F.C. Bauer, but there are certain antecedents to this, both earlier in the 19th and earlier centuries most directly, but also even in antiquity, there are certain historical questions that are being asked.
Yeah, and just to sort of draw out something in here as well, you've kind of pointed out within what we think of as historical criticism, there are a whole bunch of different methods and specializations. Like, it's almost like, if somebody was to say, well, I'm an anthropologist, okay, that could mean a lot of different things. Some anthropologists are going and, visiting tribes in the Amazon. Some are mostly working with texts, in a library. Others are, going out and having adventures, wielding a bullwhip and wearing a fedora, and being played by an aging Harrison Ford, right? Like, you know, there are all kinds of ways of doing it. And I don't think there are any Harrison Ford types among the historical critics, but like, I don't know, you'd know
I'm
better.
wounded there, Ben.
Listen, man, you'll get there. You'll get there.
Sorry, I should have worn my fedora to the interview.
Yeah. Well, for next time.
But you're absolutely right. So there are various different approaches or various different things scholars are doing within the very general category of historical criticism. And sometimes that approaches will directly clash, and some scholars will prefer very certain methods that'll stand in contrast with other scholars. So one particular method that a lot of historical critical scholars use that became particularly dominant in the 20th century is called redaction criticism. So how an author, particularly a gospel author, is where it's most applied because this is narrative, and as we'll talk about later, we think later gospel authors, a lot of them were using earlier gospels. Redaction criticism at its core, though, is looking at the changes evangelist or gospel author will make to the sources that they have.
Hmm.
right? So some scholars will look at that and they'll locate, and you can use this for a variety of purposes, but one way it has been used is to think about the core meaning of a gospel, right? So if a gospel author is stitching together a couple different sources, which is how some scholars would view it, I think I don't quite think that's the best way to view the process. But if a scholar thinks that a gospel author is stitching together sources, if you will, into a narrative, they'll look at what the gospel writer adds as opposed to what the gospel writer kept as being more important for meaning.
Hmm.
And certainly it gets more nuanced than that. But other we could still label as historical critics might reflect maybe a more narrative view with it as well. So they might take the Gospels as narratives, thinking we don't have to think about the pre-sources and changes to it, but we can read just the Gospel text as we have it, right? Tricky concept, but as we have it, more or less.
Hmm.
And they'll locate that narrative within a historical scope, but they'll reject the view that what is added is necessarily more important for determining meaning.
Hmm.
So there'll be discrepancies among historical critical scholars on the methods they use, and of course, in the results that they get to. But I think that's really the fun part of it all.
Yeah, yeah. We'll move on here in just a second, but sort of when I think of that umbrella and that, the historical critical, what I think of is, the historical piece, meaning that in some way, as you say, it privileges kind of the original context meaning. That's the historical piece. And
Exactly.
then critical, not meaning, not like, oh, that binding makes Mark's pages look so fat, like not that, but critical in the sense of not starting with kind of theological assumptions already baked in. So, for example, what I think of there, and this is a tricky thing, right? But whereas, let's say, an evangelical biblical scholar might just assume, well, of course, every letter attributed to Paul is written by Paul, and just take that as a baseline. Or the way that a Christian interpreter might say, well, we know that Scripture doesn't contradict Scripture, so we have to find a way for all this to make sense. So, if Matthew says that Jesus gave the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, and Luke says that he gave the Beatitudes in a sermon on a plain, like we got to figure that out there because they can't be in contradiction. A historical critical scholar is going to say, well, we don't assume that Paul wrote everything just because it has Paul's name on it. And we don't assume that these scriptures don't contradict each other. They may not, but that's seen as a question for investigation rather than just a presupposition. Is that fair to say?
I think it would. So this is where when I was thinking about a succinct definition of historical critical, the historical part was easy. The critical part was the
Yeah.
more difficult. Um, I think it would depend. Scholars are going to give very different definitions what it means by critical.
Hmm.
Some people, whether will think of critical as challenging, in fact, the very message of the Bible, saying this isn't something we need to hold on to, right? It'll go maybe past the historical into a moral critique. This is more anecdotal. I think that is a version of historical criticism. What you just discussed is a version of historical criticism a lot of self-proclaimed historical critical scholars would hold on to. I think it's important to flag with that, though. Even when historical critical scholars are approaching the text, um, the theological assumptions are going to come
Right.
with them, right?
Yeah.
And so a historical critical scholar may, on the one hand, say, we're not going to say these two texts can't stand in tension, but perhaps all the work suggests maybe that's an implicit assumption as well. But they might still claim the title of a historical critical scholar, still might
Mhm.
uh, analyze themselves in that way. To return to F.C. Bauer, he's just a fascinating example of this in terms of historical criticism. F.C. Bauer, good German Protestant, right?
Mhm.
Lutherans love F.C. Bauer, good German Lutheran. F.C. Bauer's four letters of that he attributes to the historical Paul are ones that become the easiest to fit within a traditional Protestant and Lutheran theological framework.
Mhm.
So a lot of scholars will take the mantle of historical criticism and intend maybe to set aside that, or maybe some think that is a, but others may also think that is a good historical claim, that it's bared out by evidence. So I think what you described is a way a lot of historical critical scholars would think, but I just want to flag too that as people, every scholar is going to bring in their own lenses to it
Mhm.
in addition to their historical critical lenses, and it'll shape their historical uh, work. And sometimes that will be more or less overt in the mind of the scholar than not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And that's sort of an important caveat, right? That you can never come to a text without assumptions. You can
Right.
be aware of your assumptions and somewhat selective, but that's about it. And then, when we think about historical critical work, you mentioned earlier the synoptic problem.
Yes.
Um, and we've been talking a good bit about the Gospel of Mark, which has sort of a key role in this one way or another. So can you tell us a little bit about what the synoptic problem is and how historical criticism tries to tackle that?
Great. So the synoptic problem, put simply, is the investigation of why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar in the material that they have. And in particular, we have verbatim agreement between these gospels. And the synoptic problem is going to operate at the level of there is some literary relationship between these gospels. And by that, we mean that a later author had the text of an earlier gospel in front while writing one's own gospel, right? While
Mhm.
the later author was writing their own gospel. Um, and we can know that there's some sort of literary relationship because we have verbatim agreement in the Greek in a lot of different passages. And one might say, well, maybe it's because, there are these traditions that Jesus spoke that are just passed on. But we have this, first of all, we get the issue of translation, right? Jesus wasn't speaking Greek, it was translated there. But more importantly, we have this verbatim agreement, both in terms of what Jesus says, but also narrative, right? So we know that these three gospels, there's some sort of literary or textual relationship between them. And scholars have spent a lot of time, they've spilled a lot of ink, you might say, in trying to figure out which was first, who used whom, and whether we can think about this problem just in terms of the three canonical gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Quick sidebar here. Um, there's been some work that has very, very recently that has pushed for the Gospel of John to be included more in the mix.
Mhm.
Some people argue that John knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Mark Goodacre has a book about, I believe it's entitled The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. But traditionally, that has been synoptic gospel has been used for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so that's how I'm going to use it today. So there's a clear literary relationship, and most scholars think Mark came first. We think of Mark as this the base text, if you will, right?
Mhm.
So Matthew loves Mark. 90 is I forget the exact figure, but close
90
to like
something
90,
percent of the
90,
time?
yeah, 90
Yeah.
something percent. I think it's 95 or higher of Mark is in Matthew. Matthew has a love affair with Mark, right? And Luke doesn't have quite as much, Mark. There's some whole chapter and a half or two in a row that Luke just omits. But Luke also has substantial parts of Mark as well. And most scholars, the consensus has been that Mark is the first gospel. So a lot of the effort really has gone into how are Matthew and Luke related. There's what's called four or two document hypothesis. Uh, um, I'll just call it the two document hypothesis, which will posit that Matthew and Luke both knew Mark and this hypothetical gospel named Q. And it'll explain a lot of overlaps, particularly in Jesus's sayings in Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark, in terms of this hypothetical text that scholars then reconstruct based on what's in Matthew and Luke. So that's the first theory. The second theory is what's called the Farrar hypothesis, which argues that no, Luke used the Gospel of Matthew. So it will argue that Luke both had Mark in front of him, and Luke also had Matthew in front of him when composing the Gospel, and explain those similarities that way. And particularly recently, in the last decade or maybe a little bit more or so, there's been the emergence of what's called Matthean posteriority, which argues that no, challenging both ideas and saying instead, Mark was first, Luke was second, Luke knew Mark, but then Matthew knew both Luke and Mark. So those are the three dominant theories today. And scholars, we could get into the weeds for why scholars believe one or another, but those are the three main ways that scholars will engage with the synoptic problem, right? It's a lot of the question hinges on whether you believe that Q, or this hypothetical source, is the best explanation or not. And then if you say no, then the Farrar hypothesis and the Matthean posteriority hypothesis are left to duke it out. But if you hold to Q, there's no need for either of the two.
For those listeners who might be wondering what James Bond's gadget guy is doing in this, just a very quick summary of what this whole Q thing is. So, and what I heard you say, Jonathan, is that sort of in each of those three options, Mark is generally seen as first.
Yep.
Where Matthew and Luke fall, people like to argue about. Part of the reason for that is because when there's a story in Mark, we usually find it verbatim in Matthew and Luke, which suggests that Matthew and Luke are both copying from Mark. However, there are some stories that are not in Mark, but they're in Matthew and Luke. And so the question becomes, do Matthew and Luke have another source that they're reading? And that source has been called Q because the German word for source starts with Q, and historical criticism is German. Or was Matthew or Luke reading one or the other, and that's how they got those stories? So, yeah.
Right. And the classic example of this would be the Sermon on the Mount and Sermon on the Plain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Mark doesn't have any of this at all, but if you're thinking of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? We have that blessed are material only in Matthew and Luke, and we see it in variation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Matthew, blessed are the poor in spirit, Luke, blessed are the poor, and scholars will take that, and if you believe in Q, you're going to try and figure out which one of those is older, right? But yeah, so that's just an example off the top of my head of what is often attributed to Q.
Yeah. Now, I imagine that, like, if I was talking about this with people in my parish, somebody might ask me, why would these scribes have to have somebody else's gospel in front of them? Aren't they just dictating all of this material from Matthew, Mark, or Luke? Why would they bother to compare with somebody else?
One thing, we can take the Gospel of Luke. Luke has this great prologue, the first 4 verses, and Luke himself is saying, I wanted to make a very orderly account, and so I'm looking at everything from the beginning, right? So Luke wants to make sure that he's presenting something that's trustworthy, right? And of course, historical critical scholars will be like, what do you mean by trustworthy there? We don't think it means it's all historically accurate, right? Which I also don't think is Luke's point, but I digress, right? So there are a couple different dimensions to your question, but first of all, Luke himself is saying he's using other sources.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's not an eyewitness. He's relying on other accounts.
Yeah.
Not all scholars, right? But I would say a significant majority of scholars take these Matthew, Mark, and Luke labels and point out we only get these for sure. We only get these attributions for sure in the 2nd century, right? So well after the Gospels were written, and a lot of them will say, we don't actually think this is by these people. We can just take Matthew, for instance. If Matthew was an eyewitness, why would he spend so much time to mark? Why why would he need to do that? Right. And so it's also a complicated topic, as everything is among historical critical scholars, but the majority of scholars don't attribute these labels to the Gospels when they were first circulated. So these are
Yeah.
personas we think were added on later on. So it's best and this is part of being a historical critical scholar,
Mhm.
right? Taking that under scrutiny, there are a few scholars who argue maybe these are original. I'd also call them historical critical scholars because they're doing this scrutinizing work. Um, but most scholars do not. So we don't think about those persons as explanations for the gospel relationships.
Yeah.
We're starting with what we see, and what we see indicates a more literary relationship, especially in light of the fact that these attributions were probably added later.
Yeah. Yeah, and so yeah, two things there, as you say. First is that part of the reason why they might be consulting other manuscripts is because they're scribes, and that's what scribes do.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
that's you're also in a time period where everything is being copied out by hand, and part of the reason for consulting multiple manuscripts is because there's human error in there. There might be letters that are missing from a word. Sometimes there were whole lines that were dropped. So when you're copying out these texts over and over again, you have to be checking things. And then the other thing, as you say, is just because we call them the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke doesn't mean we believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were sitting down and writing them.
Exactly.
I remember reading one article that suggested that those names were almost like sort of the marquee that you see outside of a theater, where if some movie is playing, it's gonna say like starring Daniel Craig in huge letters up top, and then and also with yada yada, the less known actors. And so there's maybe a sense that whoever is putting these gospels out is claiming to have talked to Matthew, Mark, or Luke as kind of their star witness, but is not necessarily, that doesn't mean that that person wrote the gospel.
This is a known figure that we want to attribute to.
Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah, which gets into my next question, because one thing that historical critics will sometimes do, and I think this is something you and I have both had conversations about over beers, they'll sort of try to reconstruct a gospel community. So for example, one of the many things that some historical critics do is they read a gospel and try to say, what can we learn about the church that wrote this gospel from the text? And there have been all kinds of ideas about, we think that the Gospel of John was written in Ephesus. I've read people who say the Gospel of John was written in Egypt. There are probably people who think the Gospel of John was written in Mongolia, right? Like there are all kinds of cases you can make. Um, how do scholars go about trying to figure out like the original location of a gospel like that? And is it a good idea or not?
So there are a couple different aspects of that, and I uh want to differentiate between an author's location and the idea of writing for a specific community. Just to take the Gospel of John, right? The Gospel of John, there's been a very popular concept in Johannine scholarship. Johannine scholarship deals with the Gospel of John and the letters and sometimes the Book of Revelation, right? Uh, the Johannine community has been a very influential construct for the past 50 or so years in the Gospel of John. Oh, geez, more than that now. It's 2025. Um, and so this is the idea. It is written first and foremost for a particular gathering of Jesus devotees in a particular location. And of course, scholars might say, well, maybe it's for a couple in a similar location, but this fundamental idea is written for a specific group in a specific location. The other idea is just locating the author in a specific place. Often those two have been tied, but not necessarily. So I'll return to the idea of a community. This has been used to explain a couple different features. So one way that people go about thinking about the gospel community is to return to this idea of redaction criticism. So changes that the evangelist makes to a source text. And a lot of people who advocate for a community hypothesis will say the evangelist changed something to make it more applicable to the life of the community. Or in the case of John, it's a little bit dicey. People debate whether John knew the synoptics. It's a very live debate right now. And even if John knew the synoptics, the knowledge is the way in which John is using the synoptics is very different.
Yes.
But people, the classic for John in the Johannine community is looking at the passages where Jesus says, "And you will be cast out of the synagogues." Right? This was the starting point of Lou Martin, very prominent scholar and the one who really started the idea of the Johannine community. He looked at that and he saw a rupture between this community, wherever it might be, and the Jewish synagogue, right?
Mhm.
All all parts of that have been pushed back on in some way, including this idea of a monolithic Jewish synagogue or community, and the idea that Jews were cursing Christians, which we really have no evidence for happening at the time that the Gospels were writing, right? So that's just a general example of what might happen. And the attraction to this is its explanatory power. The question isn't just why would Jesus say this, but why would the evangelist write this in a gospel?
Mhm.
And the attraction of the community hypothesis is it starts to make sense of changes and it starts to make sense of specific information. Matthew 4:24 says, and Jesus' fame spread throughout all Syria, right? And a lot of people will say, well, Matthew wrote for a community in Antioch or in Syria, right? Based on this. And so the community hypothesis says, well, Matthew wanted to flag Jesus's fame spreading in the community. Or in the case of John, John wanted to discuss and theologize, if you will, give some sort of a framework for this split between church and synagogue. And again, a lot of scholars would push back on uh, all aspects of a church and synagogue split as way too simplistic and importing other categories. But a community makes sense of that material in a very concrete way, and historical scholars like to get specific, right? Historians like to get specific. It's always nice if you can locate a text in a city and start to think about what's particularly going on in a city or region, rather than say, we don't know. Um, and again, so some of this material, the casting on the synagogue, going to be particularly conducive to community. Other parts, Matthew's reference to Syria might just indicate that the author was writing in Syria. So I want to make that distinction. But at the same time, a lot of people will also say Matthew was written for a community in the Roman province of Syria. And so a lot of times those bleed together, but you can make a claim about the gospel author's location without making a claim
Yeah.
about a community. And whether it's a good idea, I myself am skeptical of it. There's been, particularly in the last, I think it's been 20 to 30 years, there's been more and more pushback against this idea on a number of fronts. One of them being simply that there's some sort of literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as we talked about with the synoptic problem. Uh, uh, to paraphrase a scholar named Richard Bauckham, we don't think that these were all part of the same community.
Mhm.
So these gospels started getting around, at least Mark started getting around to Matthew and Luke pretty early on. That doesn't necessarily negate the idea that a gospel is written for a particular community, but it's suggestive of another way. And there are certain other arguments, right? One could marshal based on, how often did people travel? How connected were these early gatherings of Jesus devotees with other gatherings of Jesus devotees in other cities, right? There are a ton of different ideas. I am skeptical and I'm cautious about it. And the biggest reason for caution with the Gospels is we don't have Gospels coming right out and saying, I am written for this community in Syria or in Egypt, right? We don't have the Gospels authors making this claim, nor do we have references to a Matthean community or a Lucan community or a Markan or a Johannine community,
Mhm.
right? Johannine community is a bit of a different animal because we have first, second, and third John, which are in the
Mhm.
form of letters. Bracket that for right now, but we don't have references to these communities. These are inferred from the text. So I think there's reason for caution because I also think there are other explanations that work just as well. Um, the idea that you'll be cast out of the synagogues. I question whether that happened historically, or at least I'm very skeptical of that. I think there are a lot of anti-Jewish assumptions that are in that sort of logic. One could simply say one was afraid of this, or maybe a group of Jesus devotees, again, this is hypothetical, maybe they were starting to be uncomfortable with this synagogue and attributed it to being cast out. There are myriads
Yeah.
of explanations for this, right? Um, Maybe it's a theologizing of the fact that most ancient Jews did not regard Jesus as the Messiah, right? This There are a number of different ways of explaining the evidence, and so I'm wary of positing a hypothetical historical construction when we have other plausible ways of explaining the evidence.
Mhm.
I do think the evangelists were Jesus devotees who were tied to other gatherings of Jesus devotees. That
Yeah.
is, might have been plugged into a community that probably was shaping a lot of their concerns, but I don't think the texts were written directly for a particular community.
Right. There's a difference between saying a book is written in community, which is just like,
Right,
duh, every book is written that way,
right,
right? And saying a book is written for a community. Um,
precisely.
and, I mean, one other thing historical critics love to talk about is sort of the genre of gospel and like whether gospel is its own distinct literary form. Listeners, you can't see this right now, but I'm rolling my eyes really, really hard. There are questions about whether like they think they're sort of inaugurating a new literary form or whether this is just a kind of ancient biography, but it does seem to me at least like they believe that they are writing something of universal significance because they all believe Jesus Christ has universal significance. So how much you really want to say they're adapting for the local community, I mean, that's my kind of non-specialist take, but there are various ways of making the case that they aren't writing for a community in a way that might allow us to explain some of these things.
Focusing on genre has been one argument uh, against the community, the gospel community
Hmm.
hypothesis, right? Some scholars have said, if they wanted to write for a community, why not write a letter?
Hmm. Yeah.
That would assume that they're writing from a different location, so then you can question that as well. But some have argued that maybe a narrative isn't the best for a community. So some people have made claims very similar to what you're talking about in their
Yeah.
argument against community.
Yeah.
The
And
com
the other thing just to note about this, at least for me, is um there's a way in which a lot of these historical conclusions build on each other, which allows you to make some really interesting hypotheses, but also, like sort of a number of proverbial dominoes have to fall your way, right? So like for example, I'm gonna make something up here, just as an example, and this way no historical critical scholars need to get offended since I'm making it up. That's okay, I don't know any of them. They wouldn't be offended
Hey.
anyway. Okay, I know one of them. So like let's go back to the Beatitudes, right? And Matthew's version is blessed are the poor in spirit, and Luke's is blessed are the poor. So there are a couple of ways to read that. Let's say I go with Matthean posteriority, and I say, okay, so Luke has a version of the Gospels that says, blessed are the poor. Matthew then reads that and says, ooh, I'm writing for this community in Antioch, which is a pretty wealthy city in Syria. We don't have many poor people in our congregation. How am I going to make this relevant for us? And he says, aha, I'm going to say, blessed are the poor in spirit, because that's how we can participate in this. So I've already made a whole bunch of assumptions. First of all, I'm assuming that Matthew has a copy of Luke in front of him when I'm writing this down, or I should say whoever the author of the Gospel of Matthew is, right? Sometimes we just use their names as a stand-in for the real author. I'm assuming that Matthew has this copy of the Gospel in front of him. I'm assuming something about his context, which may or may not be true. I mean, he may have been in Syria, he may not have been. I'm assuming something about the Syrian church that may or may not be true, that there were a lot of wealthy people. And then finally, I'm assuming that this bothered Matthew so much that he felt the need to give a more spiritualized version of the same. So, it's sort of an interesting theory, but you can kind of build it up over so many levels of assumption that it's easy to tear down. And I think something Jonathan and I kind of share, not to speak for you, but totally to speak for you. It is my podcast after all, is sometimes when you get into the community hypothesis, there are so many assumptions underlying those that it's really, really hard to make a convincing reading stick. I mean, would you say that's fair?
I, to a degree, I don't. So I again am very cautious about this, the community hypothesis. But there have also been some really good scholars who make sense of a lot of data in a very consistent way.
Hmm.
That way, but it is often based on assumptions that I don't share at the same time. So I think that coheres a good bit with what you're saying. It is easy to build things upon building things in order to get anywhere. Scholars, you could do this with the historical Jesus, the quest for the historical Jesus as well. Professor John Meyer of blessed memory, one of my mentors, was adamant that there is about the Q, about the two document theory, so that Q was a better explanation than Matthew and Luke knowing each other. He saw more independent sources that way, which gave more attestation, multiple attestation of independent sources, one of his important criteria. And
Hmm.
so his investigation for what Jesus actually said was going to be influenced by that. Um,
Yeah.
so yes, it similar things also with the community. You start building upon things. On the one hand, you kind of have to assume certain things as a historical critical scholar. On the other, that leaves you open to people are going to have other plausible explanations. So in that sense, yeah,
Yeah. So you're more cautious because you're a scholar, and I just get to be the fun podcaster who's like, no, I don't like it. Next.
that's why they pay me the big bucks.
Church academics almost paid as well as church history podcasters.
Exactly, exactly. I think it's a pretty comparable salary there.
Exactly. I'm gonna say this already knowing what your answer is gonna be. Which gospel is the best, and why is it the Gospel of John? I asked the guy who wrote his dissertation on the Gospel of Matthew.
I
So
was
go
trying to
ahead.
figure out how snarky to make that.
Go ahead.
Uh, the best gospel. Hmm, hmm. I'm gonna answer. So I'm just gonna answer. My love affair with historical critical scholarship started with the Gospel of Matthew,
Mhm.
and it's precisely because when you look at Matthew and you read it with other ancient Jewish sources, you get a love for the Torah that I hadn't seen uh, reflected in my own upbringing, right? When you read Matthew alongside other Jewish sources, Matthew has this clear, faithful love of the Torah in a way that is not reflected in a lot of other theological ways of thinking about law in general, right? So for me, in terms of my first love as a scholar is going to be Matthew. I wrote my master's thesis on it. It was what really drew me in to wanting to look at the New Testament in its historical context. There's going to be a certain beauty there um, that I saw, and I see this with other gospels too, but I just can't ever quite get away from that one lecture on the Gospel of Matthew. So for me, it's going to be the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of John, though, it has such beautiful Christology.
Yeah.
One of the things, first, when I first encountered the historical critical method, it can be quite jarring, particularly where you're coming from theologically. It was for me. It was both beautiful and in some ways very jarring. And right, so I subject all the New Testament now and other parts of ancient Judaism, Christianity to historical investigation. For a while, I I did what I needed to for classes, but really didn't think about the Gospel of John that way because I wanted to appreciate beauty as I wrestled with the historical critical method. And I just wanted to think about the beauty of the Gospel of John. And so I agree with you. The Gospel of John is wonderful and amazing. And um, I want, as I'm going to speak as a Christian, not a historical critical scholar, I want all Christians to appreciate beauty and
Yeah.
appreciate the beauty of Scripture.
Mhm.
Um, for me, that meant holding on to John and just appreciating its beauty. And took me a little while to get to historical investigation. But the beauty that unlocked historical investigation and the value of it for me was Matthew. And so I appreciate where you're coming from with John. Man, I see it. But for me, my first love is going to be the Gospel of Matthew. And I don't think I'll work on other things. I have worked on other texts, but I don't think I'm ever really going to be able to get away from Matthew.
Yeah. Well, thank you for putting that so beautifully. You've harped on something that I think you and I both saw at YDS, and it is kind of a commonplace. It's kind of a commonplace in seminary education. There's sort of a joke that the best way to turn a Christian into an atheist is to send them to seminary.
Yeah, yeah,
And
right.
they're not talking about your intro to theology class. They're not talking about your intro to pastoral care class. They're talking about your intro to Bible class because for many seminary students, the introduction to the historical critical method is so jarring, as you said.
Really.
And it can really, for a lot of people, I think particularly for people who came from traditions where, they were told the Bible is the Word of God, and the reason you know it is the Word of God is because it was written down by eyewitnesses who lived with Jesus and heard him talk and then died for that. So their honesty and trustworthiness is just above all question. And then historical criticism says, well, the Gospels sure don't look like they were written by Galilean fishermen. Um, and they adjust each other sometimes, right? So this idea that there's no contradiction in scripture, at least on its face value, is false. I mean, you can do some things to smooth out the contradictions, but they sure look like they're there, and that's really hard for people. I think you also speak to there is a kind of beauty that historical criticism can unlock, because if you let Matthew sort of speak on his own without trying to harmonize him with everybody else, you see somebody who really loves the Jewish law, who loves the Torah. And the idea of a Christian who can appreciate the beauty of the law is like that's just not something we've had for quite some time. Um, and if you try to harmonize Matthew with the other gospels too quickly, it's easy to lose out on that, right?
Yeah.
And like working in the ancient world as I do, I mean, I see this all the time because, I'll read the church fathers who I love the church fathers, commenting on Matthew. And when Jesus says, don't think I've come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it, you know, time after time they will say, yes, and it's so wonderful. Jesus fulfilled the law, so we don't have to.
Which is exactly the opposite of what Matthew is trying to say. Is like, no, Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and you better follow it too, right? Right. So, no, there's a beauty to that. Thank you for also talking about what I'm going to lecture on in class tomorrow, right? It's Matthew and the law, so always a very special day for me there. But yeah, there's this, and just to speak theologically about different portrayals of Jesus, just for a quick second. And this is again a theological reflection on the historical critical method. There were historical scholars who don't want to do any theological reflection. There are historical scholars who aren't Christian or theistic at all, right? And I think that's important. Historical criticism be a place where it doesn't matter what your religious convictions are. But if I can reflect on it as a Christian, when you're trying to describe the indescribable and the incarnation of God becoming human, no one perspective is ever going to give that clear enough. And so the multiple different portraits, I think, are a blessing and a gift, not a hindrance.
Mm. Well, I don't think I can say anything better than that, so we'll end the interview there.
Have I converted you to being a historical critic yet, Ben?
No, but this is the one time I'll let you have the last word.
Wonderful.
And we'll
Well,
start arguing about it again as soon as I hit the stop recording button.
great to be with you, Ben.
Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.